Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine, CEO of Performance Works International. This podcast is grounded in business, digital, workforce, and leadership transformation for our times. My aim is to initiate conversations with experts, leaders, professionals who've got a story to tell and who we can all learn from. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel or simply go to performanceworks.global to access all the episodes to date. I'm sure you'll find something of interest. What do the FBI, the New York State Police, the British Army, a major corporate education provider, and an agile strategist have in common? Well, they're all guests on this week's Rethink Leadership podcast. We're putting collaborative and empowered leadership front and centre to learn from the forces, institutions, and the corporate world. We're lucky to have 4 guests who are experts in their field, modern leaders, and inspiring professionals. We have Janeen DiGuiseppi, who was an officer in the United States Air Force before joining the FBI. She served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and after an impressive series of leadership roles in the FBI, is now Special Agent in charge for the FBI's Albany field office in New York State. Janeen advocates for collaborative leadership and calls for leaders to drop the ego and demonstrate more humility when working with others. Captain Rob Appleton has collaborated with Janeen on multi-force projects as captain of the Criminal Bureau of Investigation for the New York State Police, also based in Albany, New York. Rob practices and models collaborative leadership and champions the notion that if leaders think they're the smartest in the room, then they need to find a new room. It's about the many, not the few or the one. Rebecca Ryan is a futurist, agile strategist and leadership expert with experience of working with leaders across the public and private sectors. Rebecca has seen firsthand the power of collaborative leadership to enable success or block it, whether focusing and buying others into long-term visions and missions or executing short-term plays. James Cross was a commander in the British Army, also serving in the Middle East, and made the move to the corporate world following successful tours in Afghanistan and wider. Now with Duke Corporate Education, James's insights into how the corporate world can learn from collaborative empowered leadership in the forces provides a blueprint for leaders to adopt more modern practices, remove silos, and build trust across the rest of the organisation. We discuss the importance of collaborative and empowered leadership for our times, the ingredients for success, the traps to avoid, and how leaders can adapt, grow, and get closer to the rest of the organisation by acknowledging that they can't do everything alone. Stronger together to win together. Let's hear more. Well, welcome everybody to this episode of the Rethink Leadership podcast. Thank you all for joining me for this holiday special. And I'd love you all to start by introducing yourself, your leadership experience. And I'd like you to give one big leadership lesson that you've learned from all your years of experience for those tuning in. So let's start with you, Rebecca.
Hello, everybody. Rebecca Ryan. I'm a professional futurist and an economist, and my big leadership lesson is slow down to go fast.
Well, I love that one to start with. That's a great tip to start with. And James, what about yourself?
Hi, I'm James Cross. I am the European Design Director at Duke Corporate Education. My background is I spent 16.5 years as an infantry officer in the British Army, then went to finance and then came to Duke. And I say my big leadership lesson is engendering trust.
Great. So slow down to speed up, get the trust base in place as well. Janeen, what about yourself?
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. So I was in the Air Force for just under 9 years before I joined the FBI. I've been in the FBI for 24 years come this January. And I have had a lot of different experiences, but my first office, I worked in Salt Lake City for 9 years, where I worked violent crimes, drug, and public corruption investigation. While I was there, I did 1.5 years in Iraq working, and this was my first formal leadership position in the FBI. I was overseeing the Major Crimes Task Force, where I led Iraqi and U.S. federal law enforcement on working criminal investigations and really trying to teach rule of law and evidence-based cases versus confession-based cases, which a lot of the Middle Eastern countries were operating under. From there, I went back to Salt Lake City for about a year, and then I went to Afghanistan for 2 years with the FBI as a biometric lead for the FBI, working with coalition forces and the Iraq or the Afghan government. I took my first supervisory position from there in Memphis, Tennessee, as a field supervisor overseeing public corruption, civil rights, violent crimes against children, and human trafficking investigations. Then I did my penance at FBI headquarters, where I work in the criminal division for a couple of years. Great experience there. I was able to work in the public corruption, civil rights section, and then worked for the assistant director over the criminal division. From there, I went as an assistant special agent in charge in Denver, where I oversaw Denver's intelligence program, crisis management, and I had all the agent and investigative operations in the state of Wyoming. I then went to the training division, where I was selected as a section chief and was promoted to oversee curriculum management. And then I was lucky enough to become the deputy assistant director at Quantico for our FBI training academy. And then I say the luckiest to become a special agent in charge of Albany. It's the pinnacle of my career. I oversee 32 counties in the upstate New York, all the way out to Syracuse and the entire state of Vermont. And it is a amazing opportunity. It's like the team I have here and what we do here is amazing. And with partners like Rob from State Police, it's just the best career. For learning with regards to leadership, I really think that the biggest thing you have to do is have humility and be able to self-reflect. Because if you cannot take a look at how you handle situations or how you've led or dealt with people and can't take an honest look at yourself, then you can't be a good leader, because nobody's perfect. So, thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And suddenly I feel like I've achieved nothing in my life. That is quite an impressive resume that you have there, Janeen. So Rob, follow that.
My name is Rob Appleton. I'm a 26-year veteran of the New York State Police. I'm currently the BCI captain for Troop G, which is the 10 counties surrounding the capital region in upstate New York. I oversee all the felony level investigations that the state police gets involved with in that area. We also cover several specialty units as a part of my responsibilities. High profile, highly complex crimes, and the good thing is we get to form partnerships like with the FBI and several other partners, and that's how we do it. I've been blessed to have a pretty substantial amount of support from a lot of agencies, but including our own agency on top of that. My one biggest learning point for leadership for me is you can't do this alone. Leadership, as we know, is typically a lonely sport. So there's some individualism with that. However, if you take inventory and assess your own organizations, you'll find that you have all these amazing people who support you and work very hard for the mission. And performance really doesn't happen in a vacuum. No matter how good you are or how talented your CEO is or your top leadership is, the work doesn't get done without the people who are on the front lines. So that's the people answering your phones, answering your customers' inquiries, satisfying your customers' needs. Very much the same thing in public sector. And those people who are the face of your organization, as much as the CEO wants to believe that they're the face of the organization, they're really not. The people who answer the phone and are actually the frontline people are the face of your organization. And here's the thing is, you've got to acknowledge them. So, this is a team sport. Team play is important. And even if you're leading the team, you got to understand your team is what makes you shine. So you got to take care of it.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And I must thank you, because it was after our podcast that this idea came from you about collaborating with a few of the other guests and having a much broader discussion. I'm really pleased that you raised that, and we've done it. We've got it underway. So thanks, and I'd like to stick with you actually and go deeper now into the topic at hand, and ask you why it's so important in the New York State Police to be practicing and modeling collaborative, empowered leadership, and particularly what have been the results of doing so within your unit, and when you consider the cross-force collaboration like the FBI that you mentioned.
It's a very important question, and why is it important to model what we do? Well, first of all, especially in the public sector, we signed up as a public trust. Right. So there's an expectation that we get this right. And when you're expected to get it right, you have to model that behavior. It's important to model the behavior that you expect, or that it's expected of you. And the reason why you do that is because it builds and reinforces trust. Everyone involved has to trust the direction, the skill, and the integrity of the leader. If you don't have that and you can't model that on a consistent basis, day in and day out, you're going to lose the group. You can sink an organization if you don't model a behavior. I tell people all the time, those who practice do as I say and not as I do. Hey, I'm the boss now. I finally made it. If you're one of those folks who said, all right, I'm finally here, they're just going to do all the work for me and I just get to look good, you'll find that you'll eventually become ineffectual. And then the resultant failure is definitely going to be a certainty. Empowerment comes from that modeling of that behavior. It comes with that foundation of trust. And if you don't have that, then it's very difficult to empower somebody or say, I trust you to do these things, when you don't model that behavior and do the things that you're asking them to do. A great leader, my favorite leaders all the time, when they ask you to do something, you've known that they've done it before, been there before, and are willing even to do it again, no matter their title. And that's a really big thing, because at the end of the day, you want to get buy-in. And it's very hard to buy into somebody who is a do as I say kind of person versus someone who is not only going to ask you to do something, but can show you how to do it and is extremely competent in doing that. And then as you're learning to do that, they support you the whole time, even if you make a mistake or two. That is why it's so important to be there and model the behavior that you expect.
Great. And, just to come back to you on that point, Rob, when you get that right, what kind of results can you expect then as a leader or as a collaborative force?
Well, the thing is, it's pretty inspiring, because what you end up getting is you get a very agile and resilient group, because no matter what happens is, adversity is coming your way. Problems are going to show up. And so when you have trust among the group, you're modeling the behavior and you have people all rowing in the same direction, you can overcome those things. It gives you an opportunity to mitigate some of these issues that come up. Some of them are internal, some of them are external. But when you have buy-in and everybody's modeling the behavior and everybody is supportive of one another and inclusive, then the results will speak for themselves. You're able to mitigate these problems faster and move on to more issues, even sometimes adapt and change what you thought might have been your original goal, right? You have your overall mission, and then you have the goals to try and meet those missions. And sometimes those things change. And then as they change, your ability to be agile in decision-making and then resilient when problems come up will eventually lead to success. The whole thing is that, we talk about these things about leadership, and if you just do this, this, and this, everything's going to work out swimmingly. Never happens that way. I wish it did, because then it would be easy, right? But that's not what happens. So how are you able to build a resilient group? And the way you do that is you create a safe space where great ideas can happen. And then all of a sudden, the results will start to come in.
Great. I love that.
Process.
That really links to psychological safety. And I love the fact that you talk about the modeling of the behaviors, because that engages the organization. They do it with you, not for you. It's not that command and control. And you get those benefits: agility, resilience, action, the ability to look at some of the broader issues. So a great start point there. And I think, building on Rob's point, I'd love to come to you, Janeen, who among our group here have worked very closely with Rob. You've both been involved in multi-force operations at leadership level on the ground, and that's not as easy as it sounds. So how does collaborative leadership work when there are multiple leaders, different agendas, different opinions? And how did you and Rob and the other leaders involved actually make it work?
That never happens in law enforcement at all.
Right.
So I think part of it, and based off of what Rob said, is one of the things is experience, right? When you are promoted into positions without the proper experiences or background, it's very difficult, I think, to form collaborative relationships and partnerships. But my number one thing is, and as an agency, we've grown through this, is you have to leave your ego at the door. Because if you do not leave your ego at the door, you may listen to what your partners are saying, but you're not really hearing what they're saying. And when you leave your ego at the door, you're able to hear what they need, what their objectives are. And even if they're a bit different or significantly different than what your objectives are, it's okay to maybe get 70% of what you need if your partners are getting what they need too. And I think one perfect example, and I know Rob will know what I'm talking about, because I can speak to Albany, obviously. We are a very small field office. I don't have enough agents for the area that I have to oversee, and with the number of threats that we address. So we have FBI-led task forces where we have state, local partners that are on our task force, investigators that the state police, Albany Police Department, Schenectady, Troy Police, they all give us their best and brightest detectives to work full-time on our task forces so that they can be force multipliers. So even though and there are a lot of hardships with state and local right now with trying to recruit and to get to the number, they're sorely understaffed just like we are. So for them to give us up people to work with us to address crime is a big hardship for them. But they do it because we have that collaborative relationship and they trust us, that they know, like, I understand federal law enforcement. I would say we are always targeting groups and organizations versus individual people. When it comes, I'll say violent crime is a perfect example. State and local law enforcement, they are more boots on the ground. They're the ones that are answering to the mayors, the mothers and the fathers, wanting to know why that drug dealer is still operating in their city or on their street corner, and which is what we don't have to deal with. So taking that into account, I've got to figure out with the people that they've given us, how do we align our objectives of going after the organizations and tying them to international groups with what the local law enforcement and state police need, is to make sure that they can go to that community center and say, we've taken these folks that are causing violent crime or selling drugs in your neighborhood, they're gone. So we collaborate, and I can realign resources to support them while still supporting the bigger picture. And that would not happen without partnership and leaving your ego at the door and just trying to make a case for your agency. It's about understanding the bigger picture and supporting your partners.
Some really great points there. Thank you very much, Janeen. And that leaving the ego at the door is a big call to action for many traditional leaders still out there. Because once you do that, it really releases this whole spirit that we've talked about already. And I do love the, as you would call it in your forces, you'd call it the task force and the force multiplier, as you said, Janeen. That's sort of the stronger together, the whole making it stronger, more collaborative, more empowered. And you're the one that is there overseeing these things to put the resources in place to support it all. And it seems there's a lot of moving parts there. It must get quite complicated, Janeen, there sometimes. So how do you handle that? Just coming back to you very briefly, just from a leadership perspective, when you need to step in.
So that's where myself as a leader and any other SAC in the FBI is where we empower our subordinate leaders, our squad supervisors, our assistant special agents in charge. You give them the tools and help develop them so that they are the ones that they can go to Rob at the state police. They don't have to come to me for me to talk to Rob. Every level within our organization here in Albany has the freedom to contact and make decisions. And, you know, and even if the right decision isn't made, it's not about throwing somebody under the bus. As a leader, my team here knows that if things go right, they're the ones that are going to be out front and getting the credit. And if things go wrong, they land on me. I'm the SAC in the field office. I'm the one that is takes responsibility for anything that goes wrong. And there has been a lot that's gone on in this office before I got here. And I can tell you that there was a lack of trust by the people in this office with the executive management team that was in Albany. And it's taken over a year, but by putting my faith in the team, giving them tools they need, and them being able to trust me as a leader and knowing that I was going to do what I said, and then even making the hard decisions and owning those decisions, we've got, in my opinion, an empowered team now at all levels, whether it's the person sitting in the operations center answering calls in the middle of the night, or it's my squad supervisor over the violent crime squad that goes and meets with Rob and other folks at Troop G. It's all about empowering your people and developing the trust that they have in you.
It does, and more. And in fact, it's starting to reinforce some of those leadership principles and lessons that you all brought out at the beginning. And I've been making a note of those because I'm going to come back to that right at the end. I'm adding to that list and developing a leadership profile, which is looking pretty good at the moment. So now we're going to cross the pond and we're going to go to the UK, and we're going to look at another force, but also the bridge between the forces, the institutions, and the corporate world. And James, I'd love to bring you in here. You now work for Duke Corporate Education, but you were a commander in the British Army. And I'd love to hear from you what you feel is the importance of collaborative and empowered leadership from both of those experiences. And from those experiences, I'd really like to get to the difference between what it was like in the army and what it was like walking through those corporate doors.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think collaboration and empowerment is absolutely everything, and it's the catalyst. And if you don't concentrate on those two things, you're not going to go anywhere. And certainly that was drummed into me in the military, and I don't think I would have been able to operate or survive in places like Iraq and Afghanistan without that deep collaboration and empowerment. You know, and coming on to some of the points that were talked about earlier, it is all around, and that's why I chose trust at the beginning, because it's trust that goes both ways. Your trust in the people that you're working with and you're responsible for, but also that they have trust in you. And Rob's talked about it earlier. It's about leading by example. And you know, there are so many opportunities to convince yourself that what you're doing is right, but you know in your heart of hearts it's probably not right. And so you've just always got to have that moral courage to do what you ought, not necessarily what you want. And it's not easy. But if you get it right and you have that trust and you empower your people, then they can do extraordinary things. And it really does operate as a talent catalyst inside the organization. And again, coming back to one of the earlier points, it is a real force multiplier, because you know the teams and regiments that I worked in best and had the most greatest experience, and when I reflect back on it, was where my superiors were empowering me, and that was developing me, and that was stretching me to do things beyond necessarily my initial experience. But also I had that moral responsibility to do that to my subordinates as well. And that actually, whilst you have the upfront investment of doing it, and it pays dividends when you need it to. And so moving into the civilian world, I was surprised when I went into financial services that didn't exist. And there were lots of like really bright people, talented around. It wasn't that they're bad people, but just no one was capitalizing on that. And there was a fundamental lack of trust and that resulted in micromanaging, people being siloed, just given very clear direction. And it just struck me that you weren't harnessing the collective power of the group in your organization. And so I still think it's a fundamentally important thing to do, because you're just missing a massive trick in one, helping yourself to be able to, if you look at it purely selfishly, to be able to operate effectively, but also you're developing the future in that team and investing in those people.
James, there's some very important points that come out of this that not only reinforce what Rob and Janeen have talked about, but kind of build on that a little bit. And I pick up one of the first points that you mentioned, that combination between collaboration and empowerment that is the almost underpins trust, but the point that it really helps everybody get through the situation that you're in, and that's something that we don't often look at. That as a talent catalyst, as I think you put it, and referring back to the work to the force multiplier, or let me call that a workforce multiplier for the corporate world. It's very interesting to me, and I remember our last conversation, James. We touched on this, that gap in the corporate world where we almost preach this, but practicing it seems to be difficult for some leaders, where you suddenly walk through those doors, you talk the words about collaboration and empowerment, but in practice, actually, we've still got the silos. We're still kind of leading by fear a little bit. We're not empowering our people. And that brings me to Rebecca. And Rebecca, thank you also for joining me again. You work in business, you work in the public sector, private and wider. You advocate for more adaptive strategies precisely due to all of the moving parts and the uncertainties that we're seeing out there at the moment. And I'm sure a lot of what you've heard already on this podcast has resonated. And I'd love to get from you where you've seen collaborative and empowered leadership work and what you feel are the secrets of success, particularly if we're saying that in the corporate world, there is still a gap around this.
Yeah. First of all, it's wonderful to be with all of you. I've listened to all of your podcasts, and I now have another 3 pages of notes just from being a mouse in the corner and listening to this. So, Jeremy, thank you for putting this together. I guess the first thing to just remind folks is when we talk about adaptive strategy, there's the idea that as a futurist, I help people develop long-term visions of success. And we can think of that as a North Star, which is not a destination. The North Star is just a guidance system. And your strategy has to adapt. My wife is a sailor. And so you never go a straight line across the body of water. You tack, you tack, you tack, you tack. And it occurs to me as I'm listening to James and Janeen and Rob that maybe in part because of their military backgrounds, they understand how important mission is. And that really is the key to agile strategy, is if you can be really clear about mission, think of it as a North Star, think of it as purpose, think of it as vision, whatever words resonate within your organization, that is what brings that organic alignment. That is what can help create those bonds of trust. And the specific example I would use is there was a CEO of a public utility company in the United States who had seen some work I had done in his community to build a 30-year vision for the future of this community. And what was amazing was, if you had asked anybody in that community, where are you headed? Nobody knew, right? Nobody knew. And that is very common in communities. Everybody's doing kind of their own thing, and they're not thinking about the city that they live in, or the county, the town that they live in. Where are we going? But building that long-term vision was very powerful. So the CEO invited me to do that for his organization, which utilities are going through massive upheaval, VUCA, right? So how did he do it? Well, the first thing he did was he gave that psychological safety. I mean, he said, we're all going to let our hair down here. This was with his top 14 people. He created psychological safety, say what needs to be said within these meeting times. The second thing he did, which was super powerful, you might not think of it as being powerful, but they carved out 2 hours of time every 2 weeks to think together about the long-term future. And, we guided them through this process. But the reason putting time aside matters is because if you don't figure out where you're headed, if you don't make the time to do that, somebody scribbles it in their notepad in the 45th or the 55th hour of their work week. Like less than 3% of leaders spend time thinking about the long-term vision of the future. So psychological safety, they put the time into it. And then after 18 months, COVID slowed things down a little bit. They had a 6-word vision that everybody in the organization could see their way into. And it was so empowering. And so then what started to happen was people began to organically align. So from my perspective, what our other guests have here is, and it's so natural to them. I wonder if they realize how magical it is in other sectors, which is when you know the commander's intent, when you know what the mission is, it automatically brings alignment. Now, you can't do that without collaboration, and collaboration doesn't happen without trust. But from my lens as a futurist, just knowing where you're actually going is incredibly powerful.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. And you reflect exactly what I've been thinking here as well, is that I think hearing what it's like in the forces and this, whether it's mission or mission command and how that drives everything, the gold for business around that and the clarity of what mission really means is absolutely fabulous. And I thank you all for sharing those experiences around that. And Rebecca, coming back to what you were talking about there, that time out to consider what is that vision, what is the mission to get there, that is well spent, to be clear, to then be able to empower and collaborate, or use empowerment and collaboration as a multiplier of effort to move forward on the journey together, not as the few or the one, but with everybody in tow. So thank you very much for adding to that. What are the traits, the skills, the behaviors, the human touches, the secret magic ingredients that are required by senior leaders, wherever they operate, in the forces, in institutions, public, private sector, to sponsor, to advocate, and to enable strong, collaborative and empowered leadership in their workplace, and because we've heard this word as well quite a bit, in the communities where they operate. James, what would you share?
Well, I think there's several things from my perspective. I think first of all, there's self-awareness, and that's fundamentally understanding yourself and your strengths and weaknesses. And I think with that, you can then come across as authentic. And I think that is very important. Not trying to emulate someone else, or finding your own voice. And then I think it's coming back to this trust issue. Is you've got to very quickly establish within your team or organization that genuine trust that you are, doing everything you can for them. And it's your position as a leader is to serve others. It's not for them to serve you. And that comes in multiple different ways. But if you get that and you get that trust, people will follow you everywhere. Even if it's just out of curiosity, because they know that you've got their best interests at heart, and that's where you then get a team that can do extraordinary things, and you can sense it when you walk into a room and you see a team operating like that, because there's trust at all levels, up and down.
What a great way to start. And in fact, what you said there, James, relates directly, in fact, to how, Janeen, you started by talking about demonstrating humility, a bit of self-reflection. James, you talk about it as, that develops the self-awareness and the authenticity, because we talk about in business for leaders to be a bit more courageous in demonstrating vulnerabilities, the fact that they might not be the smartest in the room, and we've got a lot of gold in our ranks to pull on. When you do unleash that with trust and authenticity, then you see it happen, don't you? You're absolutely right, James. And I come back to you, Rebecca, on this. What can you add to from what you've heard there?
Well, I've been thinking a lot, because many of the panelists have talked about self-awareness and lack of ego. And this is really a hallmark of a mature leader. What the ego does. So I'm pulling a little bit on my Zen training here, but the reason that egos get strong, like, oh, narcissistic even, like that would be the outlier, is because they're trying to reify themselves. They're trying to make themselves more right than wrong. And if I want to be right, then you have to be wrong. There's always this self versus other. And what James has talked about, and what frankly Rob and Janeen have also talked about, is this idea of being completely vulnerable. And if you don't have an ego that you have to defend, that's what allows you to just do what is useful, right? Whether it's helping somebody who's having a really bad time, maybe things outside of work, whether it's like Janeen was saying, sort of taking the fall. Like if things go wrong, I'm going to take the fall. If things go right, you're going to get the win. That is such a pure expression of an ego-less leader, or a person who's figured out how to manage their ego. So I feel, I guess, a little bit embarrassed, but in my work, like this is kind of implied, but it's not as clear as what your guests have talked about today. And it certainly is important, because visions, the work I do with long-term visions, what we are fundamentally asking people is to think about a world without them. When I'm working with community leaders, I'm asking them to build something that they themselves may never see or experience. So they have to be able to think beyond themselves. And the trick I use is to think about their grandchildren or their great-great-grandchildren. But that is my way of sort of jumping over ego. Think about your own progeny down the line in the future. And maybe I have had to use that short circuit because I don't have the same language around what it means to be an ego-less leader. So that would be my reflection at this point, Jeremy.
There's so much good stuff coming out of this. This is leadership 4.0 as far as I'm concerned. And that selfless, vulnerable leadership reflects back on, just help me reflect back on what you said, James, as well, about the leaders are there to serve the team, that true empowerment of the team, and stepping up to be accountable for, when things might go wrong, but also being, recognition minded when things go right for the rest of the team and for others. That is true selfless leadership. Rob, coming back to you, what would you add to the conversation?
Well, that was fantastic. I have to say, but being honest and transparent, managing ego is not an easy thing to do. I'm going to speak for myself. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I kind of like being right. You know what I mean? It's nice. It's a good intrinsic feeling. However, as you mentioned, Rebecca, you can't put being right over others, right? I mean, because that really doesn't matter. And so you ask what some of the ingredients are, and what we've all talked about, and it's easier. It's not as easy as it sounds, but is to embrace that altruism, right? True altruism is where the mission comes first, that the group success is more important than personal success. And that's very difficult today because people have families to bring up. We're trending more to this new generation where we are becoming more family focused. And it's important to recognize that. So you have to elicit some kind of behaviors, or people have to behave in such a way where sometimes when they're at work, their mission priority really is supporting their home system, right? Because if things aren't going well at home, it's very difficult for things to go well at work. And so you have to be able to identify that. But looking for people who are willing and behave in such a way that when they're at work, that the betterment of the group comes first. And the highest form of altruism that you can ever think about is when people sign up and are willing to trade their lives so others may live a better life. And I think that's what Rebecca is talking about, is to try and figure out ways to not only embrace that, but encourage that. And then when you have it, recognize it and reward that. That's kind of what you're looking for. And then secondly, one of the big ingredients, and James has already mentioned it, was there has to be an emotional intelligence to this, because human dynamics and emotions are very real, right? So in order to come over that, you have to have a certain emotional intelligence. And as Janeen mentioned earlier, that comes with experience. Sometimes we learn through a huge dose of humble pie, right? And so that's how we grow. But that, you have to be able to understand what's going on and kind of remove yourself, compartmentalize yourself so that you can manage more effectively, more calmly, because it brings a sense of calm to the situation. And as a leader, you have to bring that sense of calm in situations that are very dire or quite frankly, an emergency in some kind. But could you imagine if you guys were having a big problem and you had a big board meeting and the CEO walks in and is like, oh my God, what are we going to do? I can't believe this is happening. Well, you've just freaked everybody out. You're not going to be able to do anything. So the way that gets brought back in is everybody has to embrace the mission. We have to have an emotional intelligence. And then there has to be a dedication to continuous improvement and learning. And that has to and always must start with the leader. You have to understand, and it was brought up earlier, no one leader knows everything. And if you're the smartest person in the room, you got to find a different room. So if you're willing to grow yourself, then the group will automatically grow with you. And then as your people grow, and James mentioned earlier, development of your people is absolutely key, because at some point, the CEO or the leader of the organization is going to change out. You are going to leave. Like in law enforcement, it's a finite game. We are here for a definite amount of time. Like for us, we have a mandatory retirement. We are out the door. So what are you doing as a futurist, right? What are you doing to leave your organization in a better place, or at least an optimal opportunity to further the success? That's really where legacy is like, right? Is what kind of a position are you leaving your organization in to others so they can grow that even further? And that's what you're hoping for, is that the person comes behind you is actually better than you are. And that's tough for some people, right? Is that to grow someone who's actually better than you are at what you do.
Some great points there. And you're right at the beginning when you talk about, families, employees, they're demanding this of their leaders now. They're demanding that things change a little bit, greater emotional intelligence. In fact, the number one demand from employees to their leaders is greater empathy. And as you were talking, Rob, and from what you were saying before, Janeen, I was reflecting, it's funny, when you talk to you both, when you put the leadership lens through life and death decisions, which you both will deal with, kind of almost every week, it really spotlights what needs to happen and where these human-centered elements are in there, because it is all about kind of those humans who are in the middle of it, but also those team members who are dealing with it too. So some very strong leadership lessons from that perspective that I'd like to bring you, Janeen, back into, and maybe perhaps add to with anything that you feel is important.
So listening to everybody, I feel like my ingredients, or how you call them, are right on point, because everything that I want to say and am going to still say, really all James, Rebecca, and Rob all hit on. But for me, you cannot be an empowered or collaborative leader if it's not about service over self. It has to be service to your people, to your communities, to your peers, and to your partners over yourself. And it all starts with that. But then it's about trust. If you're not leading from a position of trust and your team can't trust that you're going to do what you say and that you have the right intent, even if it's a difficult situation, then you're not a leader. You aren't a leader. You're someone who's holding a position and sitting in a seat. So without trust, there is no leadership at all, in my opinion. And what I think Rob and I think James hit on this too, it's, you always have to ask yourself every day or every week, how do I build something that is going to be better after I'm gone? And that comes with the development of your team, taking risks and letting them fail, because sometimes people have to fail, like Rob said, to really understand, yeah, maybe I do need to work on certain things. So how do you make things better? And you're giving your team the tools and the developmental opportunities to become those collaborative and empowered leaders. And I think the last point for me is, you have to love what you do. you can't dread what you do. If you come into work and we all have those days, because being in a leadership position, James knows, being in the military, and I'm sure he went on a lot of deployments, you have tough days. In law enforcement, you have tough days, especially for our state and local partners. And I'll say now, after the last couple of months of the Bureau, we've been taking some big shots. So it's tough, right? But if you do not love what you do, your people know that. They can see it. Everyone's going to have a bad day. They know that. But if you don't love what you do, and for us, it's about protecting the community, protecting our partners, our law enforcement partners, rescuing victims, putting bad guys in prison where they cannot hurt anyone again. If that's not your passion, your team knows it, and there is no way you're going to be an effective leader, because you have to love what you do. Dreading what you do, it's time to move on and find another career path.
No, I love to hear the word love used in this context, because it is so important to be brought in at that emotional level as much as the rational and practical things that we're dealing with as leaders. And as you started there, that service over self comes back to what many of you talked about: the self-awareness, the humility, the authenticity, and how people will respond to you. And the other thing that I like about that came out there, which is leaving things in a state that are better than when you first went there, through the empowerment of others, through letting them develop, through experimentation, through failing fast, failing often, but always failing forward. And that support from a leader is absolutely critical. Thank you all for those tips. But also, I'll come back to you all now, because, of course, not everything always goes right when we're trying to do this. And I'd love to just get kind of those people tuning in that's saying, well, yeah, I really kind of buy into this, but I know it's not going to be, smooth sailing. There are roadblocks. Janeen, you talked about, you are experiencing tough situations. So I'd love to ask you all, what are the roadblocks to collaborative and empowered leadership as you're talking about it in terms of the progress? And what's the potential cost of getting that wrong from the start, or not tackling the issues when they come up? And perhaps I can start with Rebecca on this one.
I really like this question, but it is hard to answer, because just thinking across my 25 years of working with all different kinds of organizations, there's not just one answer, but I'm going to choose one that I think a lot of people can identify with, which is cultures that are not healthy. There can be a roadblock. Janeen mentioned it, that she had inherited a position where there was low trust. And the example that I would use is I was working with an executive team on, of course, foresight. What is their vision of the future and how are they going to get there? And there was an issue when we had done the executive interviews with everybody about where they thought things should go and what they thought the roadblocks would be, sort of the one-on-one trust building exercises as a consultant. There was this issue that I would say started as a grain of sand, but it was mentioned in every executive interview, even though it was a departmental issue. And then as we got started with the project, it just became clearer and clearer that this wasn't a tiny issue. This was the issue. And so we put the whole project on pause, and then we worked with the executive, the CEO, and said, there will be no tomorrow if we do not solve this issue. And I mean, thank goodness that these were very self-aware leaders who had very little ego and wanted to get it right, but no one had ever raised this for them. And this was a very polite company. And it was much easier for them to just kind of continue to work on other things when this big issue wasn't being dealt with. So I think having the courage, when you notice at any level, right, when you notice that there is a bigger roadblock here that nobody's talking about, it takes a lot of courage to raise that. And I can say for myself as a consultant, I often develop cold sores. Like it comes out of my body when I'm working with a client situation. And I know we have to raise something that is not going to go down well. People may not want to talk about it. It could be a time bomb that just ends up exploding. But you have to ask yourself, like, if I don't do this, am I really serving the company? And in this particular case, because of people's maturity, it didn't go away immediately. But over the course of the time working on the project, it had the most beautiful and elegant resolution because people were actually talking about it together in an honest and clear way. So I would say culturally, one of the roadblocks is when we just allow these things to culturally persist. We don't name them. We don't talk about them. And then they just continue to persist.
I love that because you started by saying, sometimes we've got to slow down to speed up. But in this respect, when things are starting to go wrong, we've got to be a bit quicker to start tackling those issues because it could be a cultural issue, and that if it's allowed to go on, it can kind of destroy culture. So we've got to develop that courage to do so. So that's a great place to start. And Janeen, I'd love to come back to you for you to add on to this.
So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I believe the biggest roadblock to collaborative and empowered leadership is ego. Because if people don't think you're opening to listening and you're not willing to share and be collaborative, there's no way to move forward. And I think that we in the Bureau and intelligence agencies and law enforcement in general, we learned this the hard way on 9/11. Because there were opportunities, and I'm not saying that it could have been stopped, but there were opportunities to share information and be a team that a lot of people didn't take. And I think part of that was because leadership and the way people were leading at the time, it was about, it's my information, I'm the one that's going to make this case. Well, we didn't make the case, and thousands of people lost their lives because we weren't being collaborative. I mentioned it at the beginning. I've been in the Bureau 24 years come January, and I'm sure Rob will give a high five to this one. When I came in the Bureau, and even before that, prior to my becoming an agent in the FBI was not known as being a collaborative entity. We were known, and people, and you see it on TV still, is when the FBI shows up, they're going to take over, and the state and locals are just can get kicked to the side. That is not how we operate. We have developed over the years and become more collaborative. Whenever I go talk to chiefs and sheriffs, and I think I've shared this with Rob, when you see all the violent incidences that are occurring now in the United States, we are the first ones. If something happens in Rob's area of responsibility, we are the first ones there to provide agents to help with interviews, victim specialists to help victims and their families, evidence recovery. We bring resources not only from our field office, but from FBI headquarters and other field offices. We did it in Buffalo. And even if the case is not a federal case, which over 90% of these incidences, there are no federal charges, we're still going to be providing on day one all the resources our partners need to get that investigation, mitigate the threat if the threat is still out there, but also to build that prosecutable case for our state and local partners. And it doesn't have to be a federal investigation. And we're there from day one until the end of the process for our partners. That's because there isn't that historic ego that comes with an FBI badge. Don't put that in. No, just kidding.
Great. Thank you very much, Janeen. And it's very well worth reinforcing this as well, because ego is an important word from a leadership perspective, whether people are willing to let that go, that willingness to let that go. And the sobering point that you raised in the middle of that, this sort of life or death collaboration. I mean, this is in your lines of work and in the forces as a whole. This is what you see as critically important every day. And one word I've not heard yet, but it really struck me as key, talking to enlightened leaders, which is all four of you on this podcast, is mindset. And the mindset being there is that we need to do something differently. We need to transcend those old barriers or those old perspectives of us, no matter who we are, a leader, a force, a company. And we have to model those behaviors. That was something that came out right at the beginning. Model those behaviors to enable the rest, the collaboration and the empowerment. So, James, let me come to you for some final words on this point to add to this discussion.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, I was just thinking as the others were talking. I mean, to me, there's a couple of things actually that I think are blockers to collaboration, and I think one of them is moral courage of calling out bad behaviours when you see them, and I think, and I can think about that very personally, like as a personal situation when I just commissioned, just passed out of the academy, I had a new platoon and we were going on operations. And I sort of had a feeling in my gut that my platoon sergeant wasn't necessarily that good, but he wasn't giving me any evidence to show that. But I just sort of knew. But if I was really honest with myself, I knew that he was putting the wool over my eyes. But I wanted to trust him. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to empower him. And it all finally came to a head about 6 months where it was too much was going on to ignore it. And I ended up finding myself in this lonely position where I had to confront him and basically remove him from post. And I went back to my company commander, sort of feeling, that I'd failed somehow and that this situation shouldn't have happened, and went to him. And the interesting thing to me was they had identified that almost on day one, but were waiting to see how I responded to it. And actually they were there fully to support me, but they wanted me to come to that conclusion as part of my leadership development. And it just taught me a very powerful lesson about the importance of having moral courage, because the dynamics in that platoon changed literally overnight, because obviously the people working beneath him were encountering these bad behaviors, and they were looking to me as a young platoon commander to call it out, and I hadn't been. And so it's that to me is fundamentally, is doing what you ought, not what you want, and pushing through on that. And I think the other thing that on a wider sort of environment situation is how an organization rewards. And what I mean by that is, in the military, you're rewarded for making decisions, not necessarily on results. Results are important, but fundamentally, you've got to make a decision, and a bad decision is better than no decision at all. But if you reward purely on results, then you actually inadvertently create a risk-averse organization, because no one wants to fail, no one is going to risk anything, and you just slow everything down in agility, and you then won't get that trust, and then people won't collaborate, and you haven't empowered people. So hopefully that sort of answered the question.
Yeah, and adds to the discussion, in fact, that rewarding behaviors and efforts versus results is a very important point that underpins collaboration and empowered working for absolute sure. And your own experience reflects on what we've heard throughout this discussion, which is the leadership that are comfortable at enabling failure. I mean, if you saw it that way, your 6 months, as you described it, of not dealing with this situation, but finding your way through that, finding the moral courage to do it, then coming back and having that more collaborative discussion with the leaders and seeing how that impacted the team. I'm sure that actually helped you, to riff on what Rebecca said, that kind of 6 month delay helped you make those decisions quicker in the future. Would I be right in that, James?
Yeah, very much so. It's like you never get everything right. You're always evolving as a leader and developing and learning stuff. And I think it taught me personally a very powerful lesson that I was never going to allow that to happen again in any team I was in. And if I saw bad behaviours, I was going to call them out in the moment and not allow them to fester, because it's like a cancer. If you allow that to go on, it spreads through an organisation.
Yeah, that's where that toxicity comes in, doesn't it? You get the factions, you get the cliques, the politics, all of these things. Thank you very much for adding to that. Well, it's been such an insightful discussion between you all, and I'd love to leave with one big tip and one big trap to avoid from each of you when enabling or thinking about collaborative and empowered leadership. And I'd love to start with you, Rob, on this one.
There's a lot to get to on that. Is there one big silver bullet fix to this? Is the one big tip? And there really isn't. The problem is leadership is a very dynamic thing, but we've hit on it an awful lot. And being humble and knowing when you don't know something is extremely important. We've talked about self-awareness, continuous improvement and learning and those things. But if you don't really embrace that and understand that, again, we can't go this alone, that you need other people to bring their ideas, their innovations, their efforts, their sacrifice to the table in order for the betterment of the organization, the communities that we serve. That has to be cherished. That also has to be valued. And at the end of the day, that's all we want, is to be valued and that our efforts mean something. And the way you do that is you have to have your feet on the ground, and you have to be involved. So my big tip is lead with your hat in your hand, be collaborative, be supportive. Know what you're supposed to be doing. And then when you see really good things happening, be right there out front, rewarding that. Don't take that reward. You have to give that, as Janeen mentioned it before. You push the rewards to the people who have earned it, and those are your frontline employees. And when you have, a lot of effort, and leadership is all about effort, you give your people your best effort, you'll find that it comes back to you almost tenfold. When people realize that you're in their corner and you're battling for them, they'll run through walls for you. It's pretty much that simple. The trap is being the reason that your organization succeeds, right? It's all about ego. If you believe that, hey, you're the only reason why this is working, that's the trap. Because as you start to build on success, right, you start to gain confidence, and confidence breeds maybe some more success. And then you start thinking, holy crap, I'm the one that brought all this together. Look at me go. And then once you start heading down that road, you start getting off course. And then people will start to realize, wait a second, he's only thinking about himself. It's all about look at me. And once that starts to creep in to the minds of other people, and it may just be something that's a matter of perspective, it may not necessarily be true, but if it's demonstrated, or if people start to believe that and think that you're only about yourself, you're done. So
yeah, I couldn't
acknowledge and recognize your people, because they deserve it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rob. And I think that's kind of the essence of catching people doing it right, and also catching yourself, kind of bigging yourself up a little bit here. It is the whole, not the few or the one, which makes the difference here. So knowing what you don't know, being humble, taking away ego are all of the routes to success, but they can also be the roadblocks that get in the way. So thank you very much for that, Rob. Rebecca, what can you add to that?
Yeah, so it has occurred to me as I've been enamored with this conversation and your guests, Jeremy, that, I, as a consultant, I'm often outside the team observing. So when I prepared my response to this question, I thought about for myself. So it had to meet a twofold test. Like, what is the big tip that works for myself around my own team, and I've seen work for our clients? And then what is the trap? And so my tip is, remember your why. Why are you doing this? Because we all run into the crap. If you are a beating heart human, you are going to run into obstacles that may seem insurmountable. But if you have a purpose that is bigger than the obstacle, you will get through it. So always remember your why. The second thing, the big trap to avoid, again, I work as a futurist. It is difficult to get people to think about a long-term future because the present feels so urgent, right? And that is the trap, is the urgency, the perceived urgency of the present. I don't have time to think long-term because look at all these emails I have, or look at all these meetings I have to prep for. And that is the trap, is believing, I mean, this might sound a little esoteric, but believing that like time is this finite resource. Because what we know is if we put some time towards thinking long term, it's like my dad used to always say in his woodworking shop, measure twice, cut once, do some planning so that when the inevitable happens, you've got that North Star to help guide you through.
Yeah, great points there. And that making that time is so important, that period of reflection after you've kind of answered that question why. I'm sure I've read, I'm sure it's the Journal of Neuroscience, they talk about even a 15-minute period of reflection can boost productivity by 25%. Now, if that isn't a reason to take time and make time for leaders, I don't know what is. So thanks for raising that, Rebecca. James, coming to you, what can you add?
Well, I think I'm probably going to end up echoing Rebecca, because I think my first thing is it's about your purpose, and that is to serve the people beneath you. And I know I mentioned that before, but I think that's fundamental to it. That is your purpose as a leader. And then I think that the pitfall is that short-term thinking. I think you've always got to be thinking in everything you're doing, thinking to the finish and asking you, so what's going to happen when we do this, get to this next stage, rather than thinking just, I'm getting from A to B, but just it's a mindset shift. So I think to sum that up, it would be understand your role as a leader and constantly remind yourself of that. And that comes to all our points about ego and humility and etc. But secondly, always be thinking that what's the next step, think to the finish. And where is this actually going, rather than being trapped in the moment and starting to mistake, activity for action.
I love that. And I know I've done that many times, and you've just made me pause in my tracks there. I have to say, activity over action, you're absolutely right. What next? What if? And what is our core purpose, as you reflect back from what Rebecca said there. Janeen, coming to you, how can you close this discussion for us?
So everybody kind of stole what I was going to say, so I'm going to try to reword it a little bit. But I mean, I think it comes to the conversation we've had this morning. It's about being the leader that's there for their people and their communities and their partners, not for themselves. If you're there for your team, then you're going to be a good leader, because you're going to check your ego at the door. You're going to do what you need to do to empower your folks and be collaborative. I would say, hitting on one of James's points earlier, one of the biggest pitfalls is when you want to be there for your team, some leaders want to be friends with everyone, and that's always to have positive relationships, but it's not always a case. So you have to have the moral courage to hold people accountable. So one, to improve who they are. But if you're not holding those accountable that are not doing the right thing, that can have a negative impact on your entire team. So doing the right thing and holding people accountable in a fair way will make you a better leader.
What a great way to end that. And I'm going to bring you all on screen just for the close of this, because it's being there for others, it's enabling others, it's supporting others, but it's also having that moral courage to step in when things need to be steered in a different direction, but also when you need to catch people doing it right and kind of give them that boost in terms of the behaviors that they're displaying. Everybody, I would love to thank you for joining me. It's been an insightful, enlightening conversation. Lots of great stuff. I started actually making a list of great leadership traits we can take out of this. I've got 3 or 4 pages here, which I now can't summarize because there's too many. So I'm going to try and put those together. But thank you all for joining me. It's been a real pleasure, and enjoy the holidays.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It was awesome. You guys are rock stars. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
really
Bye-bye,
learned
everybody.
so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel or simply go to performanceworks.global to access all the episodes to date. We'll see you next time.